Yes. I mean, I think we've talked enough about Christian and Islamic and all the other theology. I just wanted to ask you because I just made a video on soul. So how do you think philosopher should understand soul? Because it's not, can you think it should be proven?
Okay. I might need 3 hours just to begin to talk about this. Well, what sort of proof would we want? The first place to start, I think, is probably Descartes. So the name is spelled Descartes, but it's a French name, and the pronunciation we use is Descartes. So Descartes is this, I'm thinking 1600s, I think 1600s philosopher. I don't have my centuries mixed up, do I? Descartes is the 1600s philosopher who talks about the soul a lot. And for the record, I think there are some problems with Descartes' philosophy of soul, but a good place to understand philosophy of soul is to start with Descartes. And where Descartes starts is to say, I think, therefore I exist. And to understand that thinking is not the same thing as matter. So, ye teacup hai. And my teacup is not the same thing as my mind. I know it's not the same thing. It's obviously not the same thing. Now, I actually know what my mind is better than I know what the teacup is. And I know that they're not the same thing really, really well. And that's all the proof of soul you need. Now, if you want to know all there is to know about the soul, you need to do a lot more work. But that I think is a pretty darn good proof of the existence of soul. I am thinking.
I also don't believe
what matter
that
is.
You need some proof, right? I don't personally think that a person would need some proof to believe in his own soul. That's, of course, something that I totally relate to. And the video that I'm talking about, that was a 4-minute video in which I mentioned Descartes. You said that Descartes, they talked about, I think, therefore I am cogito ergo sum, right? But one of the things that I mentioned in there was a thought experiment by Ibn Sina or Avicenna, who came 600 years before Descartes, right? And because if you look at the cogito, Descartes was his aim was not to prove the existence of soul. He wanted to get rid of this problem that he said that how can I absolutely believe on something that, right? So he came up with this because he was very much haunted by this radical skepticism. I think he got really extreme, where he thought that his mind might be on some other planet and might be controlled by some devil or something like that. So he was guided by radical skepticism. But Ibn Sina, he actually wanted to prove the existence of the soul. So he came up with this thought experiment, which is called Flying Man thought experiment, in which it says that there is this man who has just been created, and he is just hanging up there in the sky, and all his limbs are detached from himself, so he cannot feel even his own limbs, and he doesn't even have any memory because he's just been created at this point of time, and he doesn't even have any experience. So he asks that would this man be aware of his own existence? And our intuition would tell us that yes, he would be aware of his own existence. So I just want your view on this. What do you think about this? Do you think it's illogical to even question the existence of soul? Because they say that it's just the central nervous system or an effect that is created by the central nervous system. There's nothing like an immaterial soul, there's nothing like that. So how do you respond to that?
Okay, so it is interesting that some of these great Western philosophers like Descartes and Hume were actually doing things that some of the Muslim philosophers were doing a few centuries earlier. Not that they didn't do anything original, but some stuff Hume said about causality and some stuff Descartes said about the soul were largely already done by Al-Ghazali and Ibn Sina, right? Okay, so I think Descartes is right about some things, and among them are, I think, therefore I exist, and I can think about matter, and I have a fairly good idea what matter is. I know that it occupies space. These days we might say it's made of particles and energy or something like that. And I know that that's not the same thing as thought, but I know that I'm thinking. So I know that there's something that thinks that is not the same thing as what occupies space. I think that is about all the only proof of soul you need. I think the idea that soul should be studied in some other way, shall we say a more materialistic, scientific way, like we should research, we should look at the brain and see if we can find a soul there, or we should try to find some sort of scientific proof of the soul. Now, I think that is largely beside the point. I think we don't need that. I think Descartes' evidence for the existence of the soul and its distinctness from matter was all right from the beginning. Now, there can be a scientific investigation of some things pertaining to soul. I think there's been some really good work in that area by people like Jeffrey Schwartz. And I also think now I should say that I have some problems with Descartes. And one problem with Descartes is he defines the soul as something completely separate from matter. And I don't think that's right. I think the soul is well, I subscribe to a theory called Halomorphism. Halomorphism says there is soul and there's matter, and the two are mixed. Or a little more precisely, what a human being is a combination of soul and body, or soul and matter.
This is also the Islamic view, actually.
Yeah, I would.
You've got the concept of nafs, which says that the nafs is the body and the soul. Like right now, we both are nafs, which is the self. So self, which is nafs, and I mean nafs. It's really difficult for people to basically give a meaning of that, and not many people are able to give them. And soul, in the Quran says, one of the commentaries of the verses of the Quran is that there was a group of Jewish people that came to Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and they asked him about soul. So this verse was revealed that God said that, regarding soul, we haven't given humanity very much information. So the soul is one of the least told concepts. And you said that you believe, or you subscribe to the view that soul is basically mixed with the body. And this is something that, Islam also says that soul resides in the body. And people in the Muslim theologians believe that, the place where it is centered is the heart, is the human heart, the physical human heart. That is the point at which the soul resides. And of course, it's immaterial, right? But this is really interesting that soul and body are mixed together for a while, and when a person dies, that it goes away, leaving the body, right? But we still believe that the body has still some connection with the soul when it's in the grave, right?
Where even to begin? There's so much here. Okay, so the idea of Halomorphism is not as popular now, though it has several good philosophers representing it. Descartes sort of killed off the idea of Halomorphism in the early modern era, and we're lucky to have gone back at least to the point where several philosophers can represent Halomorphism. But before Descartes, this was the normal way of thinking about soul. This was Plato, Augustine, Aquinas, Aristotle, Boethius, Anselm, Plotinus. This was the whole, well, the dominant, not the whole, it wasn't the Stoics, but it was the dominant Greek philosophical position. It was the dominant Christian medieval position, or the only Christian medieval position. And I'm sure it was Ibn Sina, Ibn Tufil. I'm just trying to check my notes and see if I can find it in Al-Ghazali, but I can't, or I don't have time. I'm pretty sure it's in Maimonides also. Maybe that's where I read it. And anyway, I forgot what I was supposed to be talking about, but Halomorphism is the idea that the body and the soul are combined, and that's what makes a human being. And the soul is not separate from the body. Maybe it can be separated, but it's not separate. So Descartes said the soul is that which thinks, and matter is that which occupies space, and that's all there is to either of them. And this produces a problem that cannot be solved. Now, I think Descartes is right to say that I know what matter is, and I know what soul is, and I can tell that I exist and I am not the same thing as matter. But if that's the whole of your philosophy of soul, there's no way of explaining how mind connects to body. There's no way of explaining it at all. There's one way of sort of explaining it without explaining it, which is to say it's a miracle by God every time the soul connects to the body, which means your very existence, and every time you open your eyes and see something or hear something with your ears, it's the body and the soul connecting by a miracle of God. Every aspect of your embodied existence is worked by a miracle of God. I think actually Robert Adams wrote an article arguing that God exists on these grounds. But I think there's a better way, which is to say the soul is not something completely separate from matter. And more to the point, matter is not something completely separate from non-physical reality. So halomorphism is technically a definition of what a human being is. It's a theory on human soul. But before that, it's a definition of everything else. This teacup is also made of matter plus non-physical reality. The best place to start in understanding the soul, actually, maybe it is Descartes, but the best place to start in understanding halomorphism is go back to an Aristotelian understanding of what a teacup is. If all is matter, this teacup can't even exist. Because if all is matter, here's just one reason. There's lots of reasons, actually, but here's just one reason. If all is matter, this teacup is just a set of particles. And I just tap it with the stapler and it's lost a few molecules. Some of the particles are gone. Now it's a completely different set of particles, but it's still the same teacup. And what that means is it's not just a set of particles. There's something to the teacup beyond the particles. It's a non-physical nature or essence that joins with the particles and that acts on the particles and organizes them into a thing. And that thing is a combination of non-physical something plus matter.
It's really interesting. Yeah. I mean, you said that this cup is not just a physical thing. It's also there's non-physical aspect to it, right? I mean, if you had said this about the human being, that would have been understood by many people. But I mean, a cup, the materialist would argue that a cup, apart from being physical and a physical entity, they would say that there's nothing non-physical to it.
Well, that's not correct. If the cup is purely physical, then the cup does not exist. The particles exist, but the cup does not exist. So the materialistic philosophers have tried all sorts of ways to explain what's going on here. Here's some particles, and now I tap it with the stapler, and it's a different set of particles, and everyone thinks it's the same teacup, except a few philosophers who say there is no teacup at all. And one philosopher,
similar to that, yes.
And one philosopher who says it's a new teacup. Here's a teacup. Here's a different teacup. Here's a different teacup. Here's a different teacup. There's a million.
It is similar to the philosopher who said that a man does not step in a river twice. When steps in the river, it becomes a different.
Yeah. But it'd be a little more precise to say. Same person twice.
Yes.
I mean, I just lost a few skin cells and I'm still here. I still have the same body.
Yeah.
So there's no way of explaining that if all is matter. And so the materialists try to explain things. They come up with really weird theories and none of them make a lot of sense. None of them agree with common sense. What everyone knows, except people who've been deceived by bad philosophy, what everyone knows is teacups exist. And everyone knows that this is the same teacup now as it is now. But if that's true, you have to give up materialism. It's not the #1 reason to give up materialism, but it's in the top 5. And once we have that understanding of things, we can go back to Descartes and we can say that's what was wrong with Descartes. What was right with Descartes was understanding, I have a pretty good idea that matter is that which occupies space and mind is that which thinks. And those are not the same kind of reality. So I have a soul, and a soul is that which thinks. But Descartes' mistake was to separate mind from matter completely and say matter is that which occupies space, and that's all there is to know about matter. And mind is that which thinks, and that's all there is to know about mind. When in reality, non-physical and physical reality are always connected all over the place. And even with the teacup, we have non-physical reality.
Right. Do you think materialism is the only leg on which atheism stands? Or there are other legs to it?
That's a good question. I say it's a good question because there might be lots of reasons it's a good question, but I'm inclined to say that's a good question because I don't know the answer. There are maybe two major ways a person could argue for atheism, I think. One is the problem of evil. Actually, Aquinas is great here. In Aquinas' Summa Theologica, he proceeds in what we could call a dialectical manner, not like Hegel's dialectic, a better kind of dialectic. He gives a question, he gives reasons we could answer the question one way, and he gives a reason to answer the question another way, and then he gives his answer. And he always disagrees with the first way of answering the question, and sometimes he disagrees with the second way of answering the question. So when he asks, does God exist? I think this is Summa Theologica by Aquinas. You can find the English public domain translation online at newadvent.org. Summa Theologica, first part or prima pars. I want to say Article 5, question 13, question 5, Article 13. I don't know. I'll try to get an exact reference in a moment. He asks, does God exist? And of course, his answer will be yes. But before giving a yes answer, he gives reasons a person could answer no. And he gives two reasons. It's Summa Theologica, prima pars, question 2, Article 3. Does God exist? First reason, and then second reason. And these are, I think, the two major reasons a person might be an atheist. So enough with Aquinas. Reason 1, the problem of evil. Reason 1, we see too much suffering or too much evil in this world.
But still, I think the problem of evil doesn't prove that there is no God. It just proves that the God is not good enough.
Or it just proves that.
Serve atheism like that. I think, when I asked that question, what I actually meant and what I actually want to ask you is, do you think that a person can not be a materialist and still be an atheist? Can a person believe in things like soul and all the things spiritual, must be knowing about Sam Harris, right? He pushes this spiritual atheism thing. I'm just confused at what exactly he's trying to say, because atheism is the disbelief in not just God, but also anything that is immaterial, you see? So I think materialism and atheism are complementary to each other, you see?
Okay, so
what do you think?
First of all, I also am not much impressed with the problem of evil as an argument against the existence of God, but maybe for other reasons. So the other major reason would be Occam's razor. If you can explain everything without God, then you might have reason to say probably God does not exist, because Occam's razor says don't say things exist without reason. Now, there are some issues with Occam's razor in religion. Some people argue that even without good evidence, it might be best to believe, like William James gives his arguments in that direction. Okay, so that another time, inshallah. But atheism, materialism. Okay, so I think the first way you phrase the question is materialism the atheist's major, is materialism the only leg the atheist has to stand on? If we take that Occam's razor approach for arguing for the existence of God, and if we could make materialism work, then I think materialism would be the best defense of atheism. The problem, I think, is that materialism just doesn't work. It can't even explain how a teacup exists or how thought exists. And it can't explain the origins of the universe, which is to say, I think some of these arguments for the existence of God, like a Kalam cosmological argument, I think some of these arguments work pretty well. Okay, so then you say something about spirituality and atheism. Or atheism and materialism. I'm not sure which three things we're connecting. Are we connecting atheism and materialism, or materialism and, are we connecting atheism and materialism, or materialism and spirituality? I think Buddhist spirituality might work with atheism and materialism. That's probably what.
But what's paradoxical there
spiritual has done
with Buddhism, it's I mean, Buddhist tradition accepts the existence of soul, but it says that it's silent on the existence of God. And there's so many atheists that are attracted to Buddhism just because it doesn't really hold existence of God as one of the important tenets of its religion. So, but what's interesting is that how can you basically accept something immaterial like soul and reject something that is so necessary, the necessary being that he talks about as God? How can you do
Well, I don't.
that? So all this, can you make sense of this spiritual atheism?
You might be asking the wrong person. Maybe you need
as
to
a
ask
philosopher.
I can say a few things in the vicinity of this question, but I'm not sure I can answer the question. There may be, I think there are some Buddhists who are materialists. I think that is a significant form of Buddhism. But there is a very important traditional form of Buddhism that does believe in some sort of a soul. Interestingly, I mentioned Jeffrey Schwartz very briefly, who I would classify as doing a scientific study of soul, but it's not a materialistic study as such. What he does is he takes the idea of Buddhist mindfulness and he studies how we can use Buddhist mindfulness to cure obsessive compulsive disorder. And it's a remarkable scientific study of what the soul can do. And he is not a materialist. He's not a Cartesian dualist. He doesn't take Descartes' view of soul as separate from and not having anything to do with matter. I'm not sure if he's a Halomorphist or something, or some alternative, but he's not a Cartesian dualist. Anyway, I think Jeffrey Schwartz is probably both a good illustration of how we could do some interesting and useful scientific study of soul, and also how you can take something like Buddhist spirituality and use it usefully, but not in a materialistic way at all. A scientific way, but not a materialistic way, because Schwartz is not a materialist. But then what about the phenomenon of someone who recognizes soul, but not God? Atheism without materialism? I don't know. I don't know. I guess I don't know anything at all about that. I'm trying to think now, do I know any philosophers who are atheists, but not materialists? I have no idea who that is. Harris is a materialist. You mentioned Harris, didn't you?
But he still talks about meditation. He's also a neurobiologist, and he also talks about these things like spiritual experiences, right? So like if you ask a Buddhist, does he believe in God or not? I mean, I think the majority of the answer is going to be no. And because that really involves, like you talked about mindfulness, and also they've got meditation, right? Meditation is a major part of Buddhism. They used to meditate a lot. But if you ask them, what are they meditating into? What is that they are thinking about when they're meditating? They might say that it's not God, it's the self. But how do you require to believe in a God are the ones that might satisfy you to believe in the self also? Because a person who doesn't believe in God shouldn't also believe in the self. You see, you can't have it both.
I am not sufficiently knowledgeable about Buddhism to comment on this, but I believe there is at least one significant strain of Buddhism that is also trying to deny the self, or at least to deny that the self is any kind of a permanent or a metaphysical thing. In other words, they are denying the soul. They're not denying necessarily that there is a being who is conscious, or that there is some consciousness here, but they're denying that there's any spiritual being beneath the consciousness. I think that does happen in Buddhism. but I don't know of, I don't think I know of any atheist who's not a materialist. But if an atheist can discover some spirituality through Buddhism, I suppose it's a step in the right direction. I guess I'll be happy about that much. But I'd recommend not even being a materialist.
Right. I mean, you said that materialism also cannot be the most the most powerful tool or the most powerful argument that atheism has, because as you said that materialism cannot even prove the existence of something that is as simple as cup, you see, and it also cannot prove, as you said, the thoughts that we have, dreams that we, I mean, it could, I mean, science could, I think, prove to a certain extent the dreams that we have, the existence of dreams, but of course not the consciousness, because I think consciousness is really the hard problem for the atheism and by extension to the materialists. And I really think that atheism and materialism cannot be separated. Karl Marx also was I guess, materialist, right?
Yes.
I think both these things cannot be separated at all.
I don't know if they can be separated, but
and atheism is a result of materialism.
Yes, as far as I'm aware, I can't think of any atheist who's not a materialist.
This atheism, I think, is a result of materialism. You see?
Yeah, probably. Yeah. At least that's the way it usually works. There might be some weird philosopher I don't know about.
Yes.
Who tries it that way.
Okay, if I ask your own opinion, your personal opinion on the question of the future of atheism, how long do you think it's going to go? Just your personal opinion on the future of atheism. Do you think it's going to be accepted by a majority of humanity in some time in the future? What do you think about this?
I am very bad at predicting the future, but I don't think it's likely ever to be a majority view.
Because, we've got scientism, you see, these things, they say that science leads to the truth, which is really problematic because I think logic, I don't know if someone would categorize logic as a part of science, which I don't think, because science is all about experimentation and all. Logic is more about intuitiveness, right? It's more about your intuitive, the intuition, right? And I don't think it needs, like, you've got a priori knowledge and a posteriori. And I really think that belief in the soul, the consciousness, is not even based, it shouldn't even be based on any scientific process. It's very much intuitive. Like Descartes said, I think, therefore I am. That's all you need, right?
I think at this point, what I want to say is science might be a part of logic, but not vice versa. But at any rate, science is not the only form of knowledge. And science cannot be the only form of knowledge.
Exactly. Exactly.
And if it were, then there is no knowledge at all. This is something David Hume was really good at understanding, although he was also foolish enough to think that there was no knowledge, or at least knowledge of a world outside the mind. So Hume says, all knowledge of the world outside my mind must come from experience. But you can't learn anything about the world from experience except by means of some principle that you use to draw conclusions about the world from experience. A principle like the principle of induction, that I can reason about things I have not experienced from what I have, or the principle of the uniformity of nature that says all the same laws of physics are always in place. Without a principle like that, you can't do science. And that principle itself is how we do science. One of those principles. I don't think it has to be both, There has to be one of those principles at least in place in order for us to do science. It's how we do science. So you don't get it from science. So if we don't know that, then we don't know anything from science. So that's at least one principle that is not known from science, but is known if we know anything from science. And frankly, I think we do know that the Earth orbits the sun and not vice versa. I think we do know electrons exist. Therefore, there is knowledge from science, and therefore there is some knowledge that is not from science. And whatever that knowledge is, however we know that the uniformity of nature is true or that induction works, however we know that might easily be a way we also know about God or soul or morality or any number of other things. And it turns out that the stuff these philosophers and theologians have been talking about all this time is pretty much exactly what we know in those ways. It's like the first principle that you know by common sense, I am thinking. Or the common sense principle, my teacup exists and it still exists after it lost a few molecules. These common sense principles are how we know virtually everything we know. And the person who says science is the only way of knowing anything is thereby, well, committing epistemological suicide. He's saying that there's no way of knowing anything at all if he knows what he's talking about. Usually they don't know. Hume did know. Hume had the decency to know this. And the logical positivists did not know this, but Bertrand Russell at least admitted it. Since science has a foundation that cannot be known from science, there must be some knowledge that does not come from science. And if there's not, then science doesn't give us knowledge either. It's a grand exercise in sophisticated ignorance. But if science does give us some knowledge, as I think it does, then the way is clear for knowing some other things, including religion, ethics, and some of those metaphysical principles, like the teacup continues to exist. So the people who say, the people who promote scientism, which we could define as the theory that all knowledge must come from science and only science, the people who promote scientism are deeply confused. Now, of course, I go over this endlessly on my YouTube channel when I talk about Hume. It's in the Philosophers in Their Own Words playlist. It's in some other material. Some of the great modern and contemporary philosophers have been talking about this. Kant and Thomas Reid and Alvin Plantinga have been talking about this in responding to these people who said knowledge comes from science only.
No, I think knowledge comes from the intellect and also from God directly in the form of revelation. I mean, as a religious person, you would admit that.
Yeah,
but
totally.
Of course, I mean, atheists don't really have to believe in the revelation part, but at least they have to admit that knowledge apart from science, because science is also an intellectual exercise, right? But something that is more fundamental than that is the intuition, where we know certain things. Like one of the things that we should also talk about, since we are talking about this, is the problem of the subjectivity, because they say that everything is subjective. Like if you kill a child, right, they would say, I mean, the people who are honest among them, the materialists or the atheists, they would say that it's subjective, basically. Because they cannot say it's objective. We are in a situation to say that it's objectively wrong because we have God as a parameter, you see, but they don't really have anything. So they would have to judge everything based on parameters that are variable, like society, the societal acceptance, or the legal part of it. Like if a person hates a kid from a particular race and he shoots him, right, then it is bad from the perspective of the child that was killed, and also from the people who care about that child, but it's not bad from the perspective of the person who killed the child. But the theist would say that it's completely, totally, absolutely, objectively wrong and bad and evil. But atheists cannot honestly say that. If they are honest, they'll have to admit that this is subjective. This cannot be, nothing is objective for the atheist, because it cannot be. Because for objectiveness, you need something to pin your objectiveness on, you see?
I would like to just agree with that, but I am constrained by the fact that Aristotle's ethics exists. So there are different concepts in ethics. What we're talking about here is the concept of moral law. We're talking about morality understood in terms of, or concepts similar to the concept of law. We're talking about morality where if you break the right moral principles, you are guilty. You violated some transcendent standard. Aristotle's ethics doesn't do that. Aristotle's ethics talks about the proper function of the human being. And the proper function of the human being is something we need in order to be happy. But it doesn't have a concept of moral law, as far as I'm aware. Now, I like Aristotelian ethics. I think in order to understand ethics thoroughly, we need the concept of human proper function, but we also need the concept of moral law, something Kant emphasizes, something you'll find in all kinds of other philosophers, but not in Aristotle as such. I think Aristotle's ethics is good, but it's not the whole picture. So I think it might be possible to give an Aristotelian argument. In fact, I'm sure it's possible because Aristotle would have done it. Somewhere in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, there is available an Aristotelian argument against murder.
Was Aristotle religious? I mean, was he a theist or was he agnostic? What do you think?
I believe he's a theist who recognizes the existence of God, technically, but he doesn't have a moral law concept of ethics. He doesn't believe in a God who's given us commands, as far as I'm aware. His understanding of ethics.
So he was a deist, right? That makes him a deist.
Yeah, maybe deist is a better term. Maybe deist is a better term for Aristotle. Maybe. I'm not an expert in Aristotelian religion as such. But the ethics in Aristotle is not religious at all, as far as I'm aware. It's just based on the proper function of the human being. So if there is such a thing as the proper function of the human being, you might be able to say that some principles in ethics are objectively true without appealing to God. Now, I think the issue is not, I think the issue is which concept of ethics are we talking about? So if the statement is there can be no objectively wrong action without God, I don't think that's true, because I think Aristotelian ethics is a perfectly reasonable way of doing ethics. And there can be objectively true statements based on the proper function of the human being about what is wrong. But if we say, for example, that the Nazis were morally guilty and that they cannot be morally guilty without God, I think that's entirely correct. Aristotle cannot explain how the Nazis are morally guilty. He can explain how their actions are not consistent with human proper functioning and they don't support human flourishing, but he can't explain why they're guilty. So if we just specify which concept in ethics we're working with here and say, some things make you guilty, I say yes, absolutely. There can be no objectivity. There can be no objectively true statement about something being morally guilt. There can be no objectively true statement about an action being wrong in such a way that committing the action makes you guilty. There can be no objective truth of that nature without God. I think that is correct.
Yeah, I mean, like it could be argued that, I mean, they might come up with this as an argument that, you know, killing a child might not be legal. Of course, it's not legal on all the countries. So they might say that, okay, that in that respect, it's objectively wrong. But if I come up with a situation where the person who is killing is not located in any political entity, he is just in any place where there are no rules and no authority to check upon what's happening, then what is the basis? Why is that person wrong, right? So I don't think that they would be able to answer, because this cannot be answered, right? That person cannot be wrong objectively unless you believe in a God.
He can't
You
be
see?
guilty. He can't be guilty.
Yeah,
He can still be
morally
acting
wrong.
in
Yeah.
a way inconsistent with human proper function. But
What is that
interestingly,
human? Can you please elaborate on that proper human function? That
this is a good teacup. It will keep the tea warm for, I don't know, 30 minutes maybe. That's its function. Its function is to hold the tea and keep the tea warm. This is a good stapler. It will staple, I don't know, up to 10 pages probably. It's not meant for big projects. It'll do some pretty decent stapling. And I don't think I've ever had any problems with it other than, actually, I don't know that I've ever had any problems with it. The staples don't get stuck like you sometimes find in staplers. So it's a good stapler because it fulfills its function well. And this is my eye. It has the function of seeing. And it's not the best eye. It doesn't fulfill its function properly. Up to about this distance, it can fulfill its function well, but anything further than that, everything's blurry without the glasses. So my eyes are not living up to their own proper function, not completely. Aristotle says human beings have a proper function. The human being as a whole, not just the eye, but the whole human being has a proper function. And it involves living according to reason, et cetera, et cetera. And it involves the virtues of wisdom, courage, justice, moderation, et cetera, et cetera. But the idea that humans have a proper function, as far as I'm aware, it doesn't require the existence of God, except maybe as the designer of the proper function. Like you might argue that the eye has a proper function and that there can't be a proper function for the eye unless God designed it. That argument might work. And you might similarly argue that the human being as a whole cannot have a proper function unless God designed us with one. But as far as I can tell, the concept of proper function does not mean God must exist morally, maybe as a designer and the backstory of how we got these proper functions. But I don't see how the idea of proper function requires the existence of God, morally speaking. If I use the stapler improperly and use my eyes improperly by trying to staple my eyes, thoroughly ridiculous example, but if I try this, I'm probably going to be misusing the stapler. It's not going to work very well like that. And I'm certainly going to be misusing my eyes. It's behavior that's not conducive to proper function. But merely by failing to do the behaviors that lead to proper function of my eyes, I'm not thereby guilty. It's like forgetting to brush my teeth once in a while. If I didn't floss my teeth last night, that doesn't make me guilty. That just means I'm not following good dental advice for the proper functioning of my teeth. And in Aristotelian ethics, that's all you can get. All you can get is failing to live by the objective truths of human morality in such a way that you're not taking good advice for being a properly functioning, happy human being. It's not guilt. So if the particular concept we're talking about, when we think of murdering a child or Nazis or something, if that particular concept is just any kind of objectively wrong behavior, I don't actually agree with the argument that says God must exist if there's any objectively wrong behavior. But I absolutely agree with the argument that says violation of moral law, objective truths about the violation of moral law do require the existence of God. I think God must exist because the Nazis were guilty. I think the Nazis were breaking moral laws. And I don't see how you can have a moral law without a moral law giver, namely God.
Right, right. I mean, from an atheistic perspective, morality should not even exist because it cannot be proven. Morality in and of itself is something that, right, it cannot be proven empirically or any other way other than God by the giver. Yes.
Aristotelian proper function morality might possibly be able to exist according to atheism if you're not a materialist, because proper functions only exist if they exist, and proper functions are not physical things. So just as the teacup cannot exist, even if it survives a few of its particles, unless not all is matter, I don't even think the teacup can have a proper function unless not all is matter. So I don't think materialism is consistent with any kind of morality being true. But if there were somebody who believed in proper functions and rejected materialism, but were also an atheist, I think maybe Aristotelian ethics would work. But of course, that person doesn't exist. I've never heard of a philosopher who thinks that. All the people who recognize proper functions and know what they're talking about are pretty much by definition not materialists. And all the philosophers who admit that materialism is not the case, I don't know, I think they're all religious. I can't think of any exception. I'm checking, I can't come up with anything. Now there's one philosopher, and it's been annoying me from time to time for years because I can never remember his name. There's one philosopher who believes in an Aristotelianish proper function ethics, and I think he is a materialist. I think he just makes the mistake of not understanding metaphysics very well. Proper functions are not physical things. I don't think he understood that.
I mean, what I really think is that in the absence of the belief in God, the most important function of a human being in this life would be to fulfill his desires and his pleasures, to live a life with utmost pleasure, the most pleasure possible. And if a person is deriving that pleasure in killing a child, who is going to stop him from doing that in an right, in a godless world?
In a godless world, I don't see how he could fail to be, no, in a godless world, I don't see how he could be guilty. But there might be someone to stop him. So Epicurus says, the good life is the life with pleasure. And it's because of that we actually need virtue. I guess I could elaborate, or I could just shut up, and maybe you don't need me to start lecturing on Epicurus.
Yeah, it's good. Yeah, I mean, you're right. But what works for me is that the fact that atheists find it really difficult to, these questions, they find it really difficult to answer, that why killing a child is morally wrong and why it's objectively wrong, and why incest is wrong, all these things. I mean, that very fact, and the fact that we take these things very seriously. Killing a child is something that really disturbs, just thinking of that really disturbs us. That to me proves morality. That's enough for me personally.
I think I agree. I just don't want us to state the case carelessly. It's not merely the idea of some kind of morality. It's a specific idea of morality that involves moral law. Yeah, that's it. I can't elaborate without just repeating myself. It's a specific idea of morality that involves moral law.
Okay.
Makes that true.
Okay, so I think we have touched upon a lot of topics today, right? And I really want to thank you for being here, right? And giving your time. It was really a wonderful and informative talk with you. What do you think about this?
My pleasure. Bahut shukriya.
Conclusion.
Yeah. No, I'm no good at conclusions. Sorry. I enjoyed our conversation, but I'm no good at conclusions. If
yeah, I mean, it was really a good time to learn. I mean, I really thought that I would get to learn so many things, which I did get, right? And this was really beautiful.
Bahut shukriya.
Can you say a sentence in Urdu? Any sentence?
मेरी उर्दू अच्छी नहीं. मेरे पास 5 साल FC कॉलेज में, लेकिन still मेरी उर्दू अच्छी नहीं.
मेरी उर्दू कमजोर है.
Yeah, see, you talk in Urdu, and I immediately fail. I didn't even understand your third word. I think it was the third word.
Kamzor means weak. Weak.
Okay.
My Urdu is weak. It's not strong.
I don't remember that word.
Yeah.
But there may be some distinction between Lahori Urdu and
Indian Urdu, yes, of course.
And actually, where are you in
Yeah.
India? You probably told me. I can't remember.
North India.
Okay, North India.
North India.
Yeah, there might be
yes.
differences between in Urdu there and Lahori Urdu. I don't know.
I mean, in Pakistan, it's more refined. The Urdu is more refined. It has more Arabic words. In here, we've got more Hindi words. But the place where it was basically invented was in India, in this place that I'm from, not from Pakistan. In Pakistan, the majority of people might speak, natively speak a different language than Urdu, might speak Punjabi or Sindhi or Balochi or something like that. But in India, in North India specifically, we speak, even the Hindus speak Urdu. They don't even realize that they're speaking Urdu and they're using words that are Arabic, but they think that it's Hindi. But internationally, it's called the Hindustani dialect, which is not neither purely Urdu nor it's Hindi purely. So that's what we speak here.
Acha.
बहुत अच्छा लगा आपसे बात करके. बहुत कुछ
Sounded
सीखने को
beautiful,
मिला.
but
Yeah.
I can't even properly understand even that. It's terrible. In Cantonese, Ngoi Sai, in Urdu, Bahut Shukriya.
What other languages do you know? Do you know Hebrew?
I only actually know English. I have some abilities with New Testament Greek and some smaller abilities with Augustinian Latin. And I tried to learn some Urdu and made progress, but never got very far when in Pakistan. And now I'm trying to learn some Cantonese, but I'm making very slow progress.
Might be very difficult.
Yeah, Cantonese is a bit more challenging than Urdu.
Okay. Okay, so I think we'll meet again someday whenever you get time. It was really good. And so I think we should end this. What do you think?
TK.
Okay. Allah Hafiz.
Allah Hafiz.